Hi, I'm Brother Jake, and welcome to part 2 of Brother Jake Defends the Book of Mormon. First, let's do a quick recap. Back in part 1, I explained what an anachronism is and talked about a few things mentioned in the Book of Mormon, like horses and cows and wheat and a bunch of other stuff that critics point to as examples of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, which they say means the Book of Mormon is just made up and isn't a real history written by real ancient Americans on real gold plates and then buried for over 1,000 years in upstate New York before being translated by the power of God off the special rock in Joseph Smith's hat. Oh, and I talked about a nifty little method for resolving some of these so-called issues. So if you haven't looked at part 1, go ahead and check it out. Okay, on to part 2. So even though I think we did a really good job of putting a lot of this anachronism stuff to rest in part 1, turns out that it wasn't exactly all of them. Like, there are a couple more little loose ends that we need to tie up, but don't worry, just like last time, it's really not a big deal at all. Let me explain. So, it turns out that in addition to the plants and animals that I talked about last time, there are a few cultural details in the Book of Mormon that may, at first glance, not seem to line up with the ancient Americas. Like, for example, metallurgy and the wheel and Christianity and wearing silk and using coins as money and having a 7-day week and using compasses. But you know what, just like part 1, let's just take them one at a time. Okay. Metallurgy, the branch of science and technology concerned with the properties of metals and their production and purification. Okay, so in the Book of Mormon, it does mention the Nephites and Lamanites doing stuff like refining and using metal, and specifically steel, which critics and experts say is a problem because apparently no one's ever found like any swords or anything that would indicate that any ancient American culture had the technology or knowledge to make steel or whatever on a large enough scale to supply an army. But you know what? All that stuff is just metal, right? So who's to say some culture, like the Nephites, didn't use metal, but then all the swords and stuff just, rusted away or something? Stuff rusts away all the time, just like this supposedly stainless steel knife that you can have for just 3 easy payments of $19.95. Japanese made my abs. Anyway, I mean, sure, finding the actual swords themselves isn't necessarily the only way to figure out if an ancient culture used steel, since discovering any of the tools used to mine and extract it, or the furnaces used to refine it and smelt it, would also count as evidence of a metalworking society. And I suppose that steel objects can technically leave behind chemical traces in the soil hundreds of years after the objects themselves have disintegrated, since the production process creates isotopes or something that aren't exactly naturally occurring. But maybe when it says steel, it doesn't mean that the swords were made out of steel. Maybe it just means that like another metal, like iron, had been steeled, which is a less intensive process that can make the iron harder but doesn't create like steel. Well, I mean, I guess that doesn't completely solve the problem, because even if you had the actual steel out of the picture, you still need to dig up a whole bunch of iron ore to equip an army. But maybe the Nephites just weren't that big a group, Maybe they lived and used steel in a small area we just haven't discovered yet, and then when they got all killed by the Lamanites, their swords and picks and shovels and hammers and bellows and furnaces and stuff all disappeared. I mean, yeah, that may seem like a bit of a stretch, since having metal weapons and armor has turned out historically to be a pretty big advantage, which kind of makes you question the idea that the only people that actually could use that technology in the Americas were wiped out so completely that no trace of them has ever been found, as well as the idea that the people that wiped them out didn't ever get around to actually using the metal weapons themselves. But maybe this whole thing was a misunderstanding. What it technically says in the Book of Mormon is that Nephi brought a steel sword to the New World, and then later they made swords after the manner of that original sword. But what if they just got as close to that as they could with, what they had, like, wood and like obsidian in the side or something? Maybe they just called it a steel sword or like a sword because that was, their point of reference. Or like I said originally, maybe it does mean steel sword, and we just haven't found it because they were a small group in a small area we haven't discovered yet. Have you explored every possible square inch in the Americas? Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay, let's roll on to the next one. The wheel. You get it? Okay, so there are a few places in the Book of Mormon where it mentions things that imply the use of the wheel as a method of transporting people and cargo, which is kind of an issue because apparently there's no evidence that ancient American cultures had any knowledge of the wheel before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But first of all, it's not even technically true to say that there was no knowledge of the wheel. They had wheels. They just were only on, toys and not used as a method of transportation as far as we can tell. But they had wheels, so in your face. And second of all, it doesn't even say the word wheel in the text. Man, it says chariots. And yeah, in most cases, we think of chariots having wheels, but maybe it's, chariots pulled by horses. Or like I've been saying, maybe all this stuff existed just the way it says, but we haven't found it yet. Maybe all this stuff in the Book of Mormon happened on a much smaller scale than we thought it did. Maybe that's the answer for all this stuff. The plants, the animals, the culture, the whole DNA thing. Wait, I talked about the DNA, right? Crap. All right, we're taking a detour. Okay, so here's the deal. Over the past few decades, advancements in DNA sequencing technology have allowed people to use genetics to determine where different groups of modern humans migrated from and when. Anyway, in 2005, geneticists conducted one of these studies on the ancestries of Native Americans, and it turns out that, according to DNA or whatever, they basically all come from founding populations with genetic markers originally from this region here, but whose unique mutations indicate that they kind of split off somewhere around 10 to 15,000 years ago, which lines up pretty well with the thing about them coming across the Bering Strait during the last ice age that I talked about in part 1. So these studies have made it a little difficult to stick by the idea that the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon are the principal ancestors of the American Indians, which is what the introduction of the Book of Mormon used to say, but you know what? We totally get that. So we went ahead, we tweaked it back in 2007 to say that the Lamanites were among the ancestors of the American Indians, which is totally fine because even though those DNA studies didn't exactly find any trace whatsoever of 6th century BC Semitic DNA in any of their sample, that doesn't necessarily disprove the idea that the Nephites and Lamanites could have existed. Maybe they just existed in a really small area. Think about it. If the Nephites and Lamanites were actually just a tiny group compared to all the people that came from the people that, walked across way up here, their markers might not show up in modern DNA. See, genetic studies like the one in 2005 look at DNA stored in people's mitochondria, which is like way shorter and cheaper to sequence than the whole frickin' strand, but there's a catch. It turns out that only the mother's mitochondrial DNA is passed from generation to generation, and we know from history that there were these population bottlenecks when large groups of people died off suddenly, like when the Lamanites killed all the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, or the European settlers landed in America and the smallpox plague broke out. Sorry about that, by the way. Anyway, if the Nephites and Lamanites weren't that big a group compared with the other people that might have already been there when they landed, it's not hard to imagine that their genetic signal might have gotten lost in all that noise. But you know what? Now that I think about it, I think I remember hearing something about recent advances in sequencing technology that have allowed researchers to use the entire genome in these ancestry analyses instead of just the mitochondrial DNA, which would be like way more sensitive in detecting even small population mixtures back in people's ancestry. I wonder if they redid the 2005 study with the whole genome. Let's see. Looks like they did. And apparently, dang it, it looks like the full genome studies didn't find any evidence for an ancient Jewish subpopulation existing at any point in pre-colonial Americas, but what if, look, the Nephites were told by God to marry only inside the covenant with other Nephites, right? So their DNA wouldn't be getting intermingled anyway, and then they were all killed by the Lamanites. But what about the Lamanites? What if when God cursed the Lamanites with dark skin, he changed their DNA so that it looked like the native? Actually, you know what? I feel like I shouldn't be talking about this. It feels yucky. I'll just, it's not even like we know what we're looking for in a DNA test, right? I mean, what is Nephite DNA? What is Lamanite DNA? We know Nephi and Lehi and those guys originally came from Israel, but that was thousands of years ago. Who knows what their genetic markers would look like today? I mean, it's not like as Jews, they were part of a culture that prioritized staying in the same geographic area as their ancestors and strongly encouraged only marrying within their ethnic group, thereby limiting genetic drift over time, right? And again, you wouldn't expect to find anything anyway if they were just a drop in the genetic bucket. That's my point before. With the horses, the plants, the DNA, the stuff in the Book of Mormon didn't happen all over the Americas. It took place in a much smaller area, like right here, for example. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily it happened here for sure, okay? It's just a hypothesis. It's just a model that a few Mormon scholars sketched up by reading the descriptions of the Book of Mormon and making deductions. These guys are really smart guys, by the way, really smart. And this is what they think. But it's not like the official model of how it went down. It's just something some really, 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 really smart people put together. Okay, anyway, actually, I might as well get this out of the way early. I know it says East Sea and West Sea and northward and southward in this map, and obviously those are not used in the way we typically think of those directions. But maybe for the Nephites, once they arrived, they changed the way they talked about directions. So this is north, but this is north, like Nephite north. Oh, and one other tiny thing, having Nephites be down here in Mesoamerica might also be a little hard to square, since, as you might remember, the Hill Cumorah, where Joseph Smith found the plates that Moroni buried, is like right behind where he grew up in upstate New York. And the Hill Cumorah is also mentioned in the Book of Mormon as being a place where a bunch of things in the Book of Mormon took place. So unless they traveled all the way up to upstate New York from Mesoamerica just to fight those battles, it's like, how did the plates get there? But maybe there were multiple Hills Cumorah. Maybe the battles took place at a place called the Hill Cumorah down there, and then after the Nephites Lamanites were wiped out. Moroni took the plates and wandered up here and buried the plates and was like, hey, I'm going to call this place Cumorah too, or maybe there was some other way of getting him up here or something. I feel like I'm going out on a limb here, but look, here's the deal. Mesoamerica is the only place where a lot of the Book of Mormon details really fit, at all. It's the only place with population growth at the right time, the only place with written language at the right time. If it's not here, look, it has to be here, man. Okay, where was I going with this? Oh, right. My point is that all these so-called problems go away if you let go of the traditional hemispheric model where the events of the Book of Mormon took place across North and South America and assume it happened on what those really smart Mormon scholars call a limited geography model, which means that they were a small subgroup of the overall native population, which is why we haven't found artifacts or DNA or whatever. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, but it's contradictory to argue that a civilization could exist for 1,000 years with technology that would later prove completely dominant when it arrived on European ships while simultaneously maintaining a small enough sphere of influence that all trace of it was completely lost. And sure, I guess the limited geography interpretation kind of clashes with the belief held by Joseph Smith and every prophet after him that the Lamanites were the ancestors of all Native Americans, and I get that this model also seems to conflict with the details in the Book of Mormon itself, like the part where it says that Lehi and his family were brought to a promised land that was withheld from all other nations, or when Nephi foresees that colonists would arrive in the promised land while fleeing religious persecution, pilgrims, and would dominate the remnants of the Lamanites who were the inhabitants of that land, Native Americans. But sometimes things are different than we assume, okay? Sometimes prophets are wrong about things, and we don't know for sure what all those Book of Mormon prophecies mean. I mean, who knows what archaeologists will find? All these smart archaeologists thought the Battle of Troy was a myth until they discovered it. They could find Nephite artifacts any day now. In the meantime, you can't prove that they didn't exist. That's called proving a negative, and it's logically impossible to prove a negative, because the thing you're trying to prove doesn't exist could still exist, but you just haven't found it yet. And sure, that particular invocation of you can't prove a negative could be used to defend beliefs in pretty much anything, like mermaids or the lost city of Atlantis. And yes, comparing a single event like the Battle of Troy to the existence of the Nephites might sound like I'm comparing apples and a 1,000-year-old orchard of technologically advantaged oranges, but that's what faith is for. If we could know for sure that the Nephites existed, then you'd know that Joseph Smith was a prophet and the church was true. And what's the point of that? We gotta learn how to exercise faith. And you know what? I have another little song to help you do it. Goes a little something like this. Here it is.
Oh yeah. For many months I struggled day and night to discover any scraps of evidence of my ancient Nephite brothers, but failure after failure left me feeling like a fool until I went and said as much one day in Sunday school. A deadly silence fell and I heard the teacher gasp, but luckily a learned man was sitting in the class. He said, if you're discontent cause you cannot find evidence of the tribe of Lehi, you'll feel at ease when you understand all about the incredible vanishing Nephite lands. Hey, hey, hey. You see, my boy, he said to me, it's all about perspective. You can work it out if faith is your objective. The hemispheric stuff is just the stumblings of men. So let me put those doubts to rest by singing once again a reconciliation of the things that give you pause, so you can fit your faith right inside of nature's laws. Is you can keep your faith intact if you accept the simple fact that they were guided by God's hand right to the incredible vanishing Nephite lands. All right. Thanked him for help and turned the tables to justify believing that Moroni ain't a fable. He cracked the case wide open with his clever little move. Now the Nephites are a negative that no one can disprove. So I had to tell you all about the fateful day when all the doubts that had me down just melted right away. So when those critics knock you back with all their scientific facts, just give a grin and raise your hand and invoke the ethereal, completely immaterial, unverifiable, plausibly deniable, vaguely heretical, purely hypothetical, dubiously logical, cryptozoological, totally reactionary, limitedly legendary, incredible, vanishing Nephite lands. Alright. The incredible vanishing Nephite lands. You can't prove it didn't happen, baby. They could find something any day now. In the meantime, don't you give up on the incredible vanishing Nephite land.